Those of you who have really been wishing that you could binge watch Raised by Wolves, HBO Max has heard you and has granted you one extra episode. That's right. To my surprise, when I finished the first episode of Raised by Wolves that aired last night, the second episode started to play automatically, which was nice because I felt like I could use a little bit more of the show to digest. The first episode, I have to admit, I enjoyed it somewhat, but I wasn't totally into it. And then the next episode, I think, won me over a bit more. The show is growing on me. I'd say if I had to rate it at the moment, I'd probably give it a B+, creeping up from a B-. I feel that it has a lot of stuff here that will appeal to hard sci-fi fans, but for people that are maybe more interested in dramatic storylines and in action, this show isn't quite as thrilling. But that, isn't necessarily a problem, because I think that there's definitely a lot of hard sci-fi fans out there that are probably pretty delighted by this, because they are an underserved market. There's obviously a lot of Star Wars and Star Trek type shows out there that aren't really going to appeal to hard sci-fi fans, even if they have a certain mass appeal. The first episode, Nature's Course, it was directed by Luke Scott, and I was pretty relieved to get away from his directing style. I feel like he actually kind of decreased the sophistication of the script with his directing rather than increased it. I don't want to be too hard on him. I mean, I don't think he's a terrible director, but I was definitely relieved when his tenure was over and we could move on to the next episode, which was directed by Sergio Mimica Gasson. Not a very well-known director, but someone who's done second unit directing for Steven Spielberg and done a lot of directing on television. And I think things were a little bit smoother under Gasson's hands. I think that the second episode overall was just stronger from a script perspective too. I think that filling in Mother's backstory really increased my understanding of a lot of what the show was trying to explore and a lot of the themes of the episodes before. I think that this is definitely a show that some people may want to rewatch when it's all over, because I think that the ending is really going to help us understand what a lot of it was trying to say. Clearly, with Mother's backstory, we don't know how much of this we can trust. The simulator repeatedly told her that this wasn't designed for androids, and we saw in Nature's Course that some of these memories are clearly not accurate. They don't reflect what actually happened. And the title, Infected Memory, itself kind of indicates that there's probably some distortion here, whether on Mother's part or just, occurring naturally because it wasn't designed to be a simulator for her. But in any case, we're not sure how much of this we can trust. But I think what is interesting is that the show, to me, seems to be exploring the nature of belief. Now, I've heard a lot of atheists say, I believe in science. I'm a rational thinker. That's why I'm an atheist. And it's interesting because I'm sure some atheists that is true, but I think that for many atheists, I would dare to say the majority of atheists, they come to their beliefs the same way that most people come to their beliefs, which is some combination of rational thought and instinct. And I think we see this playing out with Mother's backstory in that, she is believing, as she points out to Father, in something that she knows is real. She knows that there was a real person who reprogrammed her to raise these children. But what she believes about him, what she believes about his nature, is definitely subject to scrutiny. And I think that it's highly questionable when you think about the fact that these are infected memories that aren't necessarily trustworthy. But as Mother becomes more human, we see her embracing these beliefs more, which kind of influence her and help her to cope with her existence. They help her to be a better mother in her mind as she becomes more human and comes to care for these children to some extent. And It's interesting. I think some people will think that this relationship with the creator is quote unquote cute. It's actually rather creepy. I think that obviously this is a relationship being compared to man's relationship with the gods of various religions that they believe in. But when you take this analogy and put it with people, obviously it's not a completely direct comparison, but when you take it with a human being and you see him overriding this android's programming to cause her to do what he wants, there's a lot of ickiness to this. There's a lot of pretty bad moral ramifications. And, I think obviously a lot of atheists would argue that this is what religious people are ultimately saying God does to us with predestination and with other aspects of cultivating our natures so that we worship him. And we have to question whether Mother's love for her creator is real or whether it's something that he programmed into her in order to get her to do what he wanted. Now, again, she's an android. She was originally created with one set of programming, so he's overriding that programming to create a new set of programming. It's not like she had this identity and then he's taking that away. It's not like she has this individual identity that he's taking away from her to override her free will, but she never had free will. And in a sense, he's actually giving her more free will than she initially had. But there are definitely some comparisons to be made here, and it's a pretty fascinating plotline and probably the most interesting aspect of both of these episodes. In these episodes, we also see Mother and Father kind of coming into conflict, and this, is exploring what makes for a good parent. And Father is trying to equip the children to survive without the androids, but Mother is more concerned, more protective, and in an interesting sense, I feel like she is also the one who really is trying to get the kids to believe what she wants them to believe. I think that that's one style of parenting that we see a lot of people have. And it's interesting because typically, this is what people would say that religious parents do, that they, take their kids, they shelter them, they put them in this bubble protected from the world, and then they indoctrinate them with religious beliefs. And it's interesting to see this show exploring this with an atheistic character who's trying to take these religious kids and force them to be atheists. And I wonder, if this isn't a little bit eye-opening to some people, but I feel that it's interesting discussion because I feel like quite clearly, I think a lot of atheist parents tell their kids what to think about religious people as well. So there's really no way to raise children without telling them to believe something, or at least telling them what you believe to a certain extent. I think that the plot line with Marcus in these two episodes was also interesting, as we see him as he comes into this struggle with Ambrose. At first, I thought what they were portraying is just how people who aren't necessarily religious have used religion throughout the centuries to seize power and to get what they want. And I'm sure that was part of what they were portraying in the power struggle with Marcus and Ambrose, in that Marcus, who obviously doesn't really buy into the religion of this cult, is using their beliefs to gain power, and he uses it to justify his killing of Ambrose and his taking over of a higher ranking officer. But at the same time, we see again this tension of why do what we believe, as Marcus is someone who has never had any kind of religious belief. He's been someone who's been an atheist and probably believes that he bases that on rational thought. Possibly that is what he bases it on. There could be other reasons, but all of a sudden he's finding his beliefs confronted with his experience, which is something that I think we all have to admit influences what we believe, our everyday experiences of the world. I think many atheists become atheists because in the world they see just so much pain that they can't explain why a loving God would allow to happen. And a lot of religious people, their experience of the world, they feel justifies their belief in God. So this is a really interesting tension to see Marcus having these religious visions. Now, obviously, if the God, the deity Saul, is obviously not a benevolent deity, if he exists in this universe, which I'm assuming he doesn't, I'm assuming there's some kind of explanation for these visions that Marcus is having. But if he exists, he is inspiring the people that follow him to do terrible things. He inspired the previous person who he gave visions, the man in the pointed helmet, to rape Tempest and the other girls on the Ark. So clearly, not good. And it seems very likely that he's going to lead Marcus down a similar dark and dangerous path. So it was interesting how we kind of had this moment foreshadowed in the scene where Marcus's wife asked him to call her by her original name, her real name, when other people weren't around, and he had that blank look. And we're led to believe that he's joking and that he, knows who he is still. But there is a sense in which this is kind of a metaphor for how people have their identities, I think, taken from them as they become members of a religious community, how they kind of get absorbed into the religious community and lose their individual identities. And it's going to be interesting to see if Marcus loses his identity as he gets swept along by these visions. Now, of course, he could resist these visions, but I don't know. I feel like this show is probably going to have him be transformed into some kind of fanatic. So it's interesting. I do think that this show is having a lot of interesting discussions. If I had to guess, I think it's probably being written by a bunch of intellectually honest atheists, possibly agnostics, but more likely atheists. So very interesting stuff. Again, I don't know that this has the most appeal to people that are looking for more action-oriented stuff and stuff with more drama. They're kind of moving away from melodramatic plot lines, but for fans of hard sci-fi, I think this is pretty strong. It's not perfect. I personally don't like the costume design. When you look at the past work of the person who is the costume designer for this show, she's done a lot of historical shows. None that were amazing, like where I looked and went, oh yeah, that show had amazing costume design, but she's got a fairly, good bio going back, but she doesn't have any history in sci-fi, and I think this is probably making it challenging for her. Obviously, they're trying to evoke crusaders and different religious individuals with these costumes, but they don't look like costumes that have any practicality or that anybody would really wear. So to me, I feel like this is a little bit heavy-handed visually and just not very aesthetically pleasing. I also feel like there's a little bit of visual monotony in this show in these recent episodes because they've kind of shown us all of the planet that there is to show us. So there's just not a whole lot of striking visuals going on at this point. Everything kind of has a sameness to it visually. Obviously, I think the most striking visual in the show is when Mother turns into a necromancer. I think those visuals are pretty striking, and I think that's the visual that's the most iconic at this point in the show. Maybe we'll get some more iconic visuals as it goes on. It seems like there might be other inhabitants of this planet. We have this cloaked figure who has this map that shows the cult where to find the androids and the children. And it's going to be interesting to see how this conflict plays out. Obviously, I think that they're not going to have anyone die, most likely. There's going to be some kind of truce, I would imagine. But we'll see how this develops. So, interesting show. Very, very interesting discussion starter. Good world building. So, it's derivative of some other stuff, but what isn't? But those are just my thoughts. If you're new to the channel, I'm Drew. Please consider subscribing so you can watch my upcoming reviews of other shows and movies. If you give me a like, I'd really appreciate it. And as always, you can watch more videos right now.